At 5:17 in the morning, the first crack appeared across the 18th fairway. It ran silent at first, a thin, dark line splitting the grass like a wound opening in slow motion. By sunrise, it had widened enough to swallow half the green. Mara Voss stood at the edge of it in her robe, coffee forgotten in her hand, watching the earth she had promised an entire community was safe begin to fail beneath her feet. She had spent 3 years building Blackmere Hills into a symbol of wealth and order. Now the ground itself seemed to be arguing with her. A maintenance worker screamed near the clubhouse. Mara turned in time to see a second crater open beside the building, concrete fracturing in a jagged star pattern before collapsing inward. Water erupted from beneath the earth, black at the edges, churning upward with a pressure that no ordinary pipe could produce. Golf carts near the pro shop tilted sideways as the asphalt beneath them buckled. Somewhere behind her, a woman was shouting for her children to get back from the grass. Mara did not move. She was already running the numbers in her head, the ones she had signed off on years ago, the ones she had told herself were nothing to worry about. She grabbed the original construction map from the site office without asking permission, her hands shaking as she unrolled it across the hood of a truck. Every buried well beneath the resort had been marked with a red circle when the system was first surveyed. She counted them out loud, needing to hear the number confirmed by her own voice. 27. But as her finger moved across the paper, she stopped. One circle near the eastern boundary had been scratched out, the ink deliberately smeared until the mark beneath it was unreadable. And beside it, in fresh pencil, someone had drawn the circle back in. Someone had restarted it. She thought back to the ribbon-cutting rehearsal only 2 days earlier, the way the sun had caught the new clubhouse windows, the way she had stood at a podium and told a crowd of future homeowners that Blackmere Hills represented the safest, most carefully engineered community in the entire county. She had believed her own words when she said them. Now, standing over a map with a hidden circle staring back at her, she was no longer sure how much of what she believed had ever been true, or how much of it she had simply chosen not to question because the answers were inconvenient. The ground groaned again, a long, low sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and Mara looked up to see a geologist she had never met, walking toward the closest sinkhole with a flashlight and a calm that unsettled her more than the screaming had. He knelt at the broken edge of the earth, shined his light down into the dark, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he looked back at her over his shoulder, his voice flat, almost bored, the way people speak when they already know the answer to the question they are about to ask. "This is not natural subsidence," he said. His name was Silas Rook, and he had been called out that morning as an independent consultant hired quietly by the county after a resident filed a complaint about strange vibrations weeks earlier, a complaint that had been buried in paperwork until it was too late to matter. Silas descended a few feet into the collapsed section using a rope ladder someone had thrown down without thinking, and when he came back up, his jaw was tight. Beneath the topsoil, beneath the layer of imported turf and irrigation piping that made Blackmere Hills look like paradise, there was a concrete structure that predated the resort by decades. Mara recognized the shape of it before he even said the word. It was a relief well, one of the old pressure valves built into the dam system that had once controlled groundwater flow through this entire valley, long before anyone dreamed of building fairways on top of it. According to the official resort records, every well like it had been permanently sealed and neutralized before construction began. That was the story the HOA had told the county, the buyers, the investors, and each other. Silas straightened up, wiped his hands on his jeans, and asked the only question that mattered. "How many wells were there?" he said. Mara's mouth went dry. She already knew the answer. By the time the sun had fully risen over the ruined fairway, 3 separate crews from the county had arrived, cordoning off the entire 18th hole with yellow tape that looked absurdly small against the size of the crater it was meant to contain. Guests who had checked in early for the grand opening stood in small, uneasy clusters near the parking lot, phones raised, whispering to each other about refunds and lawsuits long before anyone official had said a single word to them. Mara moved through the chaos on autopilot, issuing calm instructions she did not entirely believe herself, while somewhere behind her eyes a single number kept repeating. 27 wells had been sealed to make way for Blackmere Hills, and the story of how they came to be buried started long before Mara Voss ever wore the HOA president's title. Before the resort, before the fairways and the artificial lake and the marble lobby of the clubhouse, this land had been part of a flood control system built around an aging dam upstream. The 27 relief wells were never decorative. They existed for one purpose only, to release groundwater pressure that built up behind the dam and beneath the surrounding valley, keeping the earth stable in a place that had always wanted to shift. When developers acquired the land 2 decades later, they saw the wells not as infrastructure but as an obstacle, an ugly, expensive complications standing between them and a golf course worth a fortune. The engineering reports at the time were clear enough for anyone willing to read past the summary page. Capping the wells without an alternative pressure system would allow groundwater to accumulate with nowhere to go. The recommendation, buried on page 40 of a document nobody in the boardroom bothered to finish, was blunt. Do not cap the system. Pressure must remain relieved through active maintenance or a replacement structure. Mara had been shown a different version of that report, a cleaner one that concluded the long-term risk was low and manageable. She signed off on the plan to seal every well, pour concrete over the openings, and build directly on top. It was efficient. It was profitable. It let Blackmere Hills open 2 years ahead of schedule. Silas asked to see the original technical archive that afternoon, expecting resistance and getting it. Mara told him the historical files had been transferred to storage and would take time to locate. When the boxes finally arrived, entire sections were missing, pages torn cleanly from binders, survey coordinates altered in ways that only became visible when Silas cross-referenced them against county flood maps from 30 years earlier. Someone had gone to considerable effort to erase the true history of this ground, and they had done it carefully enough that no casual audit would have caught it. Silas was 41 years old, quiet in the way of men who trusted instruments more than people, and he had grown up hearing about this exact dam system from his father, who had worked as a field engineer on the original relief well construction. His father used to say that valleys like this one never truly forgot the water that used to move through them, that you could bury a river but you could never convince it to stay buried. Silas had inherited both his father's caution and his distrust of glossy reports, and something about Blackmere Hills had felt wrong to him from the moment he was hired. Late that night, working alone in the site trailer while Mara fielded calls from panicked homeowners, Silas found an old scanned document buried in a folder mislabeled as landscaping permits. It was a single page, faded, stamped with a warning in bold capital letters that had clearly been added after the original survey was filed. Do not cap. Pressure must remain relieved. Beneath the warning was a signature line, and beneath that, a name written in blue ink that had not faded at all, as if it had been signed more recently than the document around it suggested. The name was Mara Voss. Silas sat with the page for a long time before he brought it to her, turning it over in his hands under the trailer light, studying the loop of the letters, the pressure of the pen, the small tremor at the end of the signature that suggested whoever had written it had been in a hurry, or afraid, or both. He was not a man who enjoyed confrontation, but he understood that some questions could not wait for a more comfortable moment. When he finally walked across the gravel lot to find her, the sky outside had gone the color of wet slate, and the crater near the clubhouse had grown another 2 feet wider since the last measurement. Mara denied it the moment Silas showed her the page, her voice sharp with the particular defensiveness of someone who has told a lie so many times it has started to feel like the truth. She insisted she had only ever approved the project based on reports handed to her by licensed engineers, that she had trusted the professionals the same way any responsible HOA president would. But when Silas laid the 2 versions of the geological assessment side by side on the conference table, the discrepancy was impossible to explain away. The original draft predicted a significant pressure increase once the wells were sealed. The final version submitted to the county board reached the opposite conclusion, and the signature authorizing that final version did not match the handwriting of the engineer whose name appeared beneath it. There was a man who might know the truth, a former engineer named Gideon Vale who had left the project 12 years earlier, under circumstances nobody at the HOA liked to discuss. Mara tracked him down to a small cabin 2 hours outside the county, half expecting him to slam the door in her face. Instead, he let her in, poured 2 cups of black coffee, and looked at her with the tired patience of a man who had been waiting a long time for this exact conversation to happen. I warned you 12 years ago, he said. Mara asked why he never went to the authorities. I did, he said. The file disappeared before it ever reached a hearing. Gideon explained something Mara had never fully understood, even as she signed the paperwork that sealed the wells. The 27 relief points were not independent structures. They formed a single balance system, and pressure displaced from one well did not simply vanish, it traveled, redistributing itself through the ground toward whichever wells remained open. Seal enough of them, and the pressure had to go somewhere. The longer the system stayed capped without an alternate outlet, the more dangerous the imbalance became, until eventually the ground itself would find its own release, violently and without warning. That night, back at the resort, a pressure sensor Silas had rigged to well number 11 spiked without explanation. He stared at the readout for a long moment before speaking. Someone is manipulating the system, he said. A security camera near the eastern maintenance gate later confirmed it. At 2:13 in the morning, a figure in dark coveralls had walked directly to a hidden access panel, moving with the confidence of someone who had studied the layout for a very long time. The figure was not there to destroy anything. Whoever it was had come to open a valve. Mara ordered every camera on the property reviewed frame by frame, and what they found only deepened the mystery instead of solving it. The intruder's face stayed hidden beneath a hood and a respirator mask the entire time, but the movements were precise, economical, the kind of familiarity that came from years of hands-on experience, rather than a stolen blueprint studied the night before. Silas watched the footage 3 times before he said what he was thinking out loud. Whoever this was did not simply know where the valves were located. They knew exactly how the whole system behaved once pressure started to shift. The valve that had been opened released pressure in one section of the buried network, but the readings from an adjacent well spiked almost immediately afterward, as if the released pressure had simply relocated rather than dissipated. Silas spent the next several hours running calculations, and slowly a different picture began to take shape, one that unsettled him more than simple sabotage would have. This person was not trying to blow the resort apart out of anger or spite. They were attempting to manage a catastrophe that was already unfolding beneath the surface, adjusting the system one careful step at a time, the way a person diffuses something rather than detonates it. If all 27 wells stayed sealed indefinitely, the accumulated pressure would eventually force its own exit, unpredictable and catastrophic. But opening the valves in the wrong sequence carried its own danger, destabilizing sections of ground that had settled into a fragile equilibrium over the past several years. Whoever moved through Blackmere Hills at night was opening each well in a specific, deliberate order, and that meant they had studied the original engineering far more closely than anyone currently employed by the resort. Mara spent that entire day fielding calls from board members demanding to know why the resort's opening had not yet been officially postponed, each conversation circling the same tired argument about liability and optics and money already spent on catering for a celebration that felt like it belonged to a different, more innocent version of the project. She found herself standing at her office window more than once, watching the tape flutter around the ruined 18th green, trying to reconcile the woman who had approved that construction plan with the woman now desperate to understand what she had actually signed. It was easier to be angry at an unknown figure moving through the dark than to be angry at the version of herself who had looked away from a warning years earlier because acknowledging it would have cost her a deadline. Mara's list of suspects grew longer with every passing hour. It could be someone from the development company desperate to protect their investment by quietly correcting the mistake before it became public. It could be a disgruntled former HOA board member with access to old files. It could be someone inside the county government trying to avoid the political fallout of admitting a permit had been approved in error. Or it could be someone with no official connection to Blackmere Hills at all. Someone who simply understood, better than anyone standing on the surface, exactly what was buried beneath it. Corbin Ashford arrived at the property before noon, dressed the way he always dressed, expensive and understated, a man who had built an empire out of convincing people that comfort and safety were the same thing. He was 52 years old, the chairman of the development company behind Blackmere Hills, and he carried himself with the kind of calm that made people forget to ask hard questions. He told Mara he only wanted to protect the value of everything they had built together, that a handful of cracks in a fairway should not be allowed to unravel 3 years of careful planning. Mara studied his face while he spoke and noticed for the first time that his calm had a rehearsed quality to it, the practiced stillness of a man who already knew more than he was willing to say. "Do not let a few cracks destroy the entire project," he told her. Mara asked him directly how long he had known about the wells. Corbin did not answer. That night, well number 19 began to vibrate beneath the earth, a low, steady tremor that Silas picked up on a portable seismograph he had set up near the clubhouse. He pulled the site map toward him under the trailer's single overhead light and traced the location with his finger, watching the color drain slightly from his own face as he realized exactly what sat directly above it. The clubhouse, full of staff preparing for a grand opening that suddenly felt very far away, was built almost exactly on top of well 19. Silas recommended an immediate evacuation of the clubhouse, and Corbin refused outright, reminding everyone within earshot that a group of investors and VIP guests had already checked in for the weekend, and that panic would cost the resort far more than a few structural cracks ever could. Mara found herself caught between 3 competing instincts: the need to protect the people currently sleeping under that roof, the need to protect a project she had spent years defending, and the need to protect an HOA reputation that was already beginning to crumble faster than the ground beneath the fairways. Several board members cornered her that evening, furious, accusing her of putting an entire community at risk to preserve her own image, and for the first time in a long while, Mara did not have a polished response ready. She had trusted reports that told her exactly what she wanted to hear, and she was only now beginning to understand how dangerous that trust had been. By the time the sun set that evening, the resort's parking lot had emptied of anyone who was not directly involved in the crisis. VIP guests quietly relocated to a hotel 40 minutes away under the thin excuse of unexpected plumbing repairs. Corbin had personally supervised the story that went out to the press, careful in his phrasing, careful in his tone, careful in every way except the one that mattered. Mara watched him deliver it from the back of the room and thought, not for the first time, that a man who could lie that smoothly under pressure had probably done it before, likely more than once, likely about something far more serious than plumbing. Silas descended into the access tunnel near well 19 with 2 technicians, their headlamps cutting narrow cones of light through the damp concrete corridor. The relief mechanism designed to release pressure gradually had failed completely. A section of the original ceiling concrete cracked clean through, water already carving a new, unauthorized path through the loosened earth around it. If that path reached the foundation lines running beneath the clubhouse, the collapse would not be contained to one section of fairway. It would be dragged down all at once. They found the valve controlling well 19 locked shut, with a padlock that did not belong there, shining and new against the corroded metal surrounding it, clearly installed within the last few days. Silas cut through it with a bolt cutter, and the moment the mechanism released, pressurized water and gas surged upward with enough force to knock one of the technicians backward. The ground shuddered. A jagged crack tore across the parking lot above them, snapping through asphalt like it was paper. Mara stood several yards away when it happened, staring down at the broken lock now lying useless in the grass beside the access hatch, and she recognized the small embossed emblem stamped into the metal immediately. It belonged to Corbin Ashford's development company. She found him minutes later near the main office, and he did not flinch when she confronted him, did not even bother to feign surprise. "You honestly think I would sabotage my own resort," he said, almost amused by the accusation. Then he handed her a folder he had clearly been carrying for hours, waiting for the right moment to use it. On the very first page, typed in plain block letters that felt deliberately cold, was a single line that reframed everything Mara believed she understood about the danger beneath her feet. Well, number 28. Location does not exist on current records. The folder Corbin handed her contained survey data that predated even the earliest documents the HOA had on file, records suggesting the original relief system had never contained 27 wells at all. A 28th well had been constructed years later, after the dam underwent a structural upgrade, added quietly to compensate for pressure changes the original design had never anticipated. It had never appeared in any resort paperwork, never been marked on the map. Mara clutched the morning the ground first opened, as though someone had gone to considerable trouble to erase its existence entirely. Corbin claimed he had only just learned about it himself, and Silas did not believe him for a second. Working through the night with a set of decades-old geological surveys, Silas traced the missing coordinates by hand, cross-referencing old flood control blueprints with modern satellite imaging until a single location emerged, far from the manicured fairways, sitting beneath a stretch of undeveloped land that had once been the subject of a bitter, forgotten property dispute. Mara recognized the significance immediately. Someone had erased well 28 from every official record specifically because acknowledging it meant reopening a legal fight everyone assumed had been buried along with the well itself. The old dispute had involved a family named Hargrove, farmers who had owned the eastern parcel of land for 3 generations before a forced buyout cleared the way for the dam's final expansion. Mara vaguely remembered hearing the name years earlier during an early planning meeting, mentioned once and never again, dismissed at the time as ancient history with no bearing on a modern golf resort. Now it sat at the center of everything, a quiet reminder that the ground beneath Blackmere Hills had been fought over long before anyone thought to build a clubhouse on top of it, and that some of those old wounds had simply been paved over rather than healed. Mara was not, in truth, a simple villain driven only by greed, though it would have been easier for everyone, herself included, if she were. She had genuinely believed once that Blackmere Hills could transform this quiet, half-forgotten valley into something thriving, something that would outlast her. She had spent years trading her reputation, her relationships, and eventually her own conscience for that vision, telling herself each compromise was small enough to justify. Somewhere along the way she had silenced a warning she should have listened to, afraid that acknowledging it would mean losing everything she had already built. That single decision, made years earlier in a moment of fear rather than malice, was quietly becoming the greatest failure of her life. Silas located the entrance to well 28, just after midnight, hidden beneath a rusted utility hatch nearly swallowed by overgrown brush. Inside, past a narrow ladder slick with condensation, he found a manual valve system far older than anything at Blackmere Hills, alongside a pressure gauge that had somehow remained functional, and a heavy metal case sealed tight against the moisture. Inside the case was a technical logbook, its pages brittle but legible, documenting decades of careful monitoring that had apparently continued long after everyone assumed the entire relief system had been abandoned. The final entry, written in a shaking, aging hand, contained a single warning that Silas read twice before he fully understood its weight. If all 27 original wells are ever sealed, well, 28 becomes the final release valve for the entire system. The moment he finished reading, the portable gauge beside him began to climb, the needle sliding steadily past every marked safety threshold. Working through what remained of the night, Silas pieced together the logbook's fragmented history, and a far larger picture began to emerge, one that reached well beyond a single reckless HOA decision. Sealing all 27 wells had never been a simple engineering shortcut approved in isolation. It had been part of a coordinated strategy pursued by a group with a very specific financial interest in how this valley developed. Their plan was straightforward in its cruelty: suppress the known risk long enough to build and sell the resort at premium prices, allow instability to surface later once the original buyers were locked into contracts, and quietly acquire the surrounding undeveloped land at a fraction of its true value once fear drove the market down. If residents grew frightened enough about the ground beneath their homes, property values across the entire valley would collapse, and whoever held cash and patience could buy up the resulting wreckage for pennies. Concealing the danger had never been a matter of simple negligence. It had been profitable, and profit did not require everyone involved to know the full plan, only enough people willing to look away when it mattered. Mara discovered something else buried in the paperwork that made her stomach turn. Her signature appeared on more documents than she remembered signing. Several of them dated well after she recalled approving the original sealing plan, the handwriting close enough to pass a casual glance but subtly, unmistakably wrong under close comparison. Someone had continued using her authority long after her actual involvement had ended, forging her name to push the cover-up forward without her direct knowledge or consent. Corbin was not entirely innocent, but he was not the only architect of what had happened either. When Mara pressed him further, he finally admitted that he had known about irregularities in the paperwork for over a year, that he had chosen silence because unraveling it publicly would have meant admitting his own company had built an entire resort on a foundation his own engineers privately doubted. He had gambled that the ground would hold long enough for him to sell his stake and walk away clean. It was not the confession Mara wanted, but it was, at least, an honest one, and in a story built almost entirely out of forged signatures and missing pages, honesty had become a rare enough commodity that she almost thanked him for it. The man who had spent years quietly controlling every legal document tied to Blackmere Hills finally stepped into the light. His name was Dorian Kestrel, 58 years old, the HOA's longtime legal counsel, a man who had spent his entire career mastering the fine print other people never bothered to read. He understood every contract, every land right, every liability clause connected to the resort better than anyone else alive, and he had spent years making sure it stayed that way. He found Mara alone in the site office and delivered his warning with the same measured calm he used for everything. "You should stop before the whole community learns exactly what you signed," he said. Mara looked at him steadily. "If I signed it, why are you the one afraid of people finding out?" she said. Dorian said nothing. Later that same night, Silas discovered a small remote transmitter wired directly into the resort's original valve control system, tucked inside a maintenance panel no current employee even knew existed. Someone was actively manipulating pressure throughout the buried network in real time, and they were doing it at that very moment. Dorian activated the system himself just past 3 in the morning, sealing several wells simultaneously in a calculated attempt to force the crisis toward a conclusion. Only he understood, and the ground responded almost immediately. Pressure surged with terrifying speed through the interconnected network. Fairway number 7 began sinking in slow, uneven collapses, swallowing sprinkler heads and cart paths whole. The resort's artificial lake started draining in strange, uneven pulses, water disappearing into cracks that had not existed an hour earlier. Inside the clubhouse, support beams groaned under stress, hairline fractures spreading across load-bearing columns that had been engineered to last a century. Mara gave the order to evacuate the entire resort without hesitation this time. And for the first time since the crisis began, Corbin stood beside her instead of against her, directing frightened guests toward the exits with none of his earlier composure left intact. Silas determined there was only one way to prevent total collapse. The wells had to be reopened, but only in the exact sequence the original engineers had designed, because releasing pressure in the wrong order would simply redirect the danger toward the residential neighborhood surrounding the golf course instead of relieving it. Mara and Silas made their way toward the old central control station buried near the eastern boundary, the ground trembling faintly beneath every step they took. Dorian was already waiting for them inside, standing calmly beside the panel he had spent the night manipulating. "You do not understand," he said. "Once this system opens fully, This entire property gets condemned. Every dollar tied to it disappears. Mara studied him for a long moment. "What are you actually afraid of?" she asked. "The truth," he said. Mara moved past him and shut down the automated control system with her own hands, cutting power to the transmitter before he could stop her. Silas worked the manual valves in rapid succession, following the sequence recorded in the old logbook exactly well by well, pressure gauge by pressure gauge. Slowly, painfully, the readings began to fall. Then a deep, muffled explosion rolled up from somewhere far beneath the ground, concrete failing under stress it had held back for years. Well, 27 had ruptured completely. A wide section of fairway dropped away all at once, taking a maintenance shed and half a cart path down with it. From the bottom of the newly formed crater, water surged upward in a violent column, and this time it was not clear. It was black. Silas stared down into it, his flashlight beam catching something thick and oily moving beneath the surface. "This is not just groundwater," he said. Laboratory tests confirmed what Silas already suspected standing at the edge of that ruined fairway. The black water carried sediment and industrial residue far older than the dam system itself, remnants of manufacturing operations that had occupied this valley decades before anyone considered building a golf resort on top of it. Digging deeper into the old survey archives, Silas found records of buried piping networks connected to that earlier industrial use, structures nobody currently employed at Blackmere Hills had ever known existed. Contaminants had been sitting undisturbed for years, sealed beneath layers of soil and rock that had held steady only as long as the original relief system remained intact and functioning. If the accumulated pressure had been allowed to fracture the surrounding earth further, those contaminants would not have stayed contained. They would have spread outward through groundwater channels feeding directly into the water supply, serving homes far beyond the resort's boundary. The 27 wells had never simply existed to stop the ground from sinking. They had been the last line of defense protecting the entire valley from something buried far more dangerous than sinkholes. Mara stood before the HOA board that same week and told them everything, refusing every opportunity Dorian's lawyers offered to soften the truth or shift blame downward onto contractors and consultants who had simply followed her instructions. She released every document she had, every altered report, every forged signature, handing the complete record over to county investigators without conditions or delay. Dorian's manipulation of the resort's finances came apart quickly once investigators started pulling threads, exposing a web of shell companies he had used to quietly buy up depressed land around the valley, positioning himself to profit enormously the moment property values collapsed under the weight of a manufactured crisis. He had never anticipated the system escaping his control so completely. Investigators later found that Dorian had quietly optioned nearly a dozen parcels of land surrounding the resort under the names of shell companies registered in 3 different states. Each purchase timed to close only once property values along the valley dropped low enough to make the deals profitable. It was a plan built for patience, designed to unfold over years rather than months, and it might have worked exactly as intended if the ground itself had not refused to cooperate on his schedule. Mara faced one final decision the night the board convened for an emergency meeting, packed with furious residents demanding answers she had spent years avoiding. She could still, even now, choose silence, protecting whatever remained of the resort's collapsing value by minimizing what the public understood about how close disaster had actually come. Or she could stand in front of everyone and tell the truth in full, knowing it would end her career, her reputation, and quite possibly the entire project she had once believed would define her legacy. She chose the truth. "I helped bury 27 wells," she told them, her voice steady even as the room went completely silent around her. Nobody moved. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of the overhead lights and the distant creak of folding chairs as people shifted in their seats, unsure whether to be furious or frightened, or simply grateful that someone had finally stopped performing certainty they did not feel. A few residents wept openly. Others sat with their arms crossed, jaws tight, clearly already composing the angry letters they intended to send to the county the following morning. Mara let the silence sit there instead of rushing to fill it the way she once would have, because she understood now that some silences needed to be earned before anyone had the right to break them. "And today," she said, "we are going to dig them back up." The Blackmere Hills golf project was suspended indefinitely within days, and county engineers sealed off the entire property while a full geological survey got underway. Excavation crews spent months carefully uncovering all 27 original relief wells, restoring each one according to the specifications the earliest engineers had intended before shortcuts and cover-ups ever entered the picture. Well, 28 was formally integrated into a new monitoring system this time. Connected to modern sensors that reported pressure readings automatically, instead of relying on a single forgotten logbook hidden behind a rusted hatch. Independent experts confirmed what Gideon Vale had insisted all along, that the system could remain stable indefinitely as long as it was properly maintained rather than buried out of convenience. The resort itself never recovered its former glamour. Large sections of the golf course remained closed permanently, fenced off and left to grow wild over ground, too unstable to build on safely. Property values across the surrounding neighborhood dropped sharply in the months following the collapse, and Mara lost her position as HOA president almost immediately, voted out by residents who no longer trusted a single word she said. She did not leave the valley, though many expected her to. She stayed, working alongside the recovery teams, answering every question investigators or residents brought to her without deflection, slowly rebuilding something that looked nothing like the image she had once tried so hard to protect. Silas left independent consulting behind and took a permanent position overseeing the valley's restored relief system, the same kind of quiet, careful work his father had once done decades earlier. Corbin faced a lengthy investigation into his company's role in concealing the original engineering reports, his once polished reputation unraveling piece by piece in the months that followed. Dorian was arrested within weeks, charged with fraud, document forgery, and manipulation of public infrastructure records. The shell companies he had built to profit from the crisis dismantled one by one as investigators traced every transaction back to him. Several months later, Blackmere Hills looked nothing like the glossy renderings that had once been used to sell it to eager buyers. Wide sections of the old course had been left untouched, grass growing tall and uneven where manicured fairways used to stretch toward the horizon. But beneath the surface, for the first time since the project began, the water moved exactly the way it was always meant to. All 27 wells stood open and monitored, their access covers replaced with clean, clearly labeled metal plates instead of the anonymous concrete slabs that had hidden them for years. Each one now bore a simple number, 1 through 27, visible to anyone who cared to look. Nothing about them was hidden anymore. Mara returned to the old 18th fairway one quiet afternoon, standing at the edge of a long crack still visible in the earth where the first sinkhole had opened all those months earlier. Crews had offered more than once to repair it completely, smoothing the ground back into something presentable for whatever the property eventually became. She had refused every time. Silas found her there, hands in his pockets, watching her study the broken ground. "You are not going to fix that?" he asked. "No," she said. "Why not?" he asked. She looked up at him, the late afternoon light catching the tired lines around her eyes. "So people remember," she said. "So they remember this place almost fell apart because we tried to bury the truth instead of dealing with it." Silas glanced toward the distant hillside, where the newly restored wellhead stood in a quiet, orderly row against the horizon. 27 small structures where 27 secrets used to be. A light wind moved across the open field, rustling through grass that had finally been left to grow the way it wanted. There was no tremor beneath their feet this time, no distant rumble of water forcing its way somewhere it was never meant to go. Just stillness, and the quiet sound of wind moving over open ground. Somewhere far below them, the old system of pipes and valves that had once been hidden under lies and concrete continued its slow, patient work, doing exactly what it had been designed to do decades earlier, before greed and convenience had ever tried to silence it. Gideon Vale visited the site once, a year after everything came apart, walking the perimeter with his hands clasped behind his back, and an expression that was somewhere between grief and quiet satisfaction. He did not say much. He simply stood at the edge of the restored wellhead line for a long while, nodding slowly, as though finally exhaling a breath he had been holding for 12 years. Mara turned and walked away from the fairway without looking back, her footsteps unhurried across the uneven earth. Some things can be buried beneath concrete for a while, but nothing stays buried forever, especially not the truth.